Back in the 90s, there were two powerhouses in North American wrestling, WWF and WCW. But out of those two promotions, only one remains today. Why is that? Well, the story of World Championship Wrestling's rise and fall is a fascinating one indeed, so join us as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish right now. And to tell the full story of WCW, we have to go back to a time before Nitro and the Monday Night Wars. We have to go all the way back to the 80s, as that was when the National Wrestling Alliance was still a dominating force in North American wrestling. And right at the peak of the NWA during this decade sat a North Carolina-based territory known as Jim Crockett Promotions. Why were they considered the jewel in the NWA's crown? Well, because they had all the biggest stars. We're talking about names like Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, and a young Sting here. But even this was not enough to help JCP in fighting off WWF when they were at their 80s peak and boasting an alternative roster of folks such as Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, and Rowdy Roddy Piper. Yes, after years of doing battle with Vince McMahon, it would be in late 1988 that Jim Crockett decided he had no more money left to fight with. Needless to say then, this threatened to put an end to the last territory which stood in real opposition to WWF. Luckily for Jim though, this would not mark the end of JCP completely, as it was here they'd be bought by billionaire media mogul Ted Turner, owner of Turner Networks. That said, just because Ted Turner now owned Jim Crockett Promotions, it didn't mean he was going to keep everything the same. No, even if he was giving it a new home on his TV station on TBS, he was going to make some changes. And the biggest of those changes would be the name of the promotion. That's right, it was in 1998 that JCP formally rebranded as World Championship Wrestling. But while lovers of the old territory were happy to see it continue to live on under the ownership of a billionaire who was going to keep it around for as long as he had a say in the matter, there were plenty of other changes to the product during the early days that they weren't too enamored with. What were some of these changes? Well, while the standard of wrestling Jim Crockett Promotions fans had become accustomed to remained incredibly high in WCW during the late 80s and even into the early 90s, what with this being the period we got things like the legendary Flair Steamboat trilogy, Ted Turner wasn't running the day-to-day of things. No, he had far too many other important jobs to do for that to be his primary concern. So instead, he'd hand over the running of the wrestling side of Turner Networks to a series of different executives, people who had no experience in the industry. People like Jim Herd. And that led to things threatening to fall apart for a while as WCW underwent an identity crisis of sorts. Were they a Southern-style wrestling territory? Or were they a company that, in their attempts to try and catch up to the industry leader, was becoming little more than WWF Light? It certainly seemed like the latter was the case for a few years there, as during the early 90s we'd get a lot of WWF-style gimmicks and storylines. Of course, that's not to say there weren't plenty of things making WCW stand out as a solid alternative as well. After all, they had a mega babyface star in Sting, a true legend of the ring in Ric Flair, and some of the best up-and-coming names out there, names like Steve Austin and Dustin Rhodes. As well as that, they almost always delivered when it came time for the bell to ring. But even this would hit a snag in 1991 when their ace in the hole, the Nature Boy, briefly left the company. Yes, it was after a disagreement with Jim Herd over the direction of his character, a direction which would have seen him cut his hair and be renamed as Spartacus, that Slick Rick decided to part ways with World Championship Wrestling and instead head over to WWF for a while. And this proved to be the last straw for many fans, as at subsequent pay-per-views, the show would be drowned out by chants of "We Want Flair." And it was a clear sign that the audience down in North Carolina were growing more and more frustrated with the struggling promotion. What they needed then was to rediscover their identity in full, something they did by bringing in a series of different bookers to try and right the ship, bookers such as Dusty Rhodes, Ole Anderson, and Bill Watts. Sadly though, each of these would always end up butting heads with the network executives who held all the real power, and this led to things inevitably returning to square one. But again, it's not like things were a disaster for WCW during the early years of the 90s or anything. No, there was still plenty to enjoy about the product. After all, by then, Sting had fully risen up as a top babyface and had some excellent foils in the likes of Big Van Vader and Cactus Jack. And when Ric Flair returned to the promotion in 1993, it was seen as another big win. That said, for every win like this that World Championship Wrestling earned, another loss would take its place, as the overall sentiment around the company was that it was in bad need of a refresh. If nothing else, it needed to actually turn a profit, something it was yet to do during the entire period Ted Turner had owned it. And that would lead us to 1993, where he made a decision which would end up changing the course of wrestling history. What decision was this? Well, it would be the bringing on board of a young entrepreneur named Eric Bischoff, someone who, in the space of just a few short years, would have turned World Championship Wrestling into the #1 promotion in the world. Of course, initially Eric's goal was just to have WCW turn a profit, and that was something he immediately set about doing as he cut costs everywhere he could, all while trying everything within his power to boost interest in the product in new ways which hadn't been tried yet. You see, Eazy-E was not a wrestling promoter in the old school sense of the term, nor was he a former wrestler himself, so he was able to look at the whole thing from an outsider's perspective and see what really needed to be done to turn things around. And what he saw when he did that was that the promotion needed a true megastar in order to grab the attention of the public, someone he'd soon find in Hulk Hogan. That's right, after leaving WWF behind in mid-1993, Hulk Hogan was looking for the next step of his career. And while he hadn't initially planned on this including more wrestling, rather he was more concerned with breaking into the world of Hollywood, in 1994 he'd be put in touch with Eric Bischoff by Ric Flair, and this would lead to the pair eventually working out a deal where the Hulkster would join the competition. And boy, was this a seismic move for WCW, as instantly it gave them a sense of legitimacy they hadn't had before when it came to being a powerhouse approaching the level of Vince McMahon's company. Seriously, almost overnight, Hulk Hogan would cause buy rates and attendance for WCW shows to jump significantly. And this was only helped by the fact that Eazy-E would soon bring in other WWF stars of the 80s like Macho Man Randy Savage as well. That said, for as much as this gave Ted Turner's promotion a major boost in terms of mainstream attention, the creative direction this led to on screen only served to alienate even more of the core fanbase, the fanbase who still longed for the days of Jim Crockett Promotions. Why was that? Well, Terry Bollea would bring with him that 80s WWF style of booking, one which would see him play the superhero babyface who always overcame the big heel challenger of the month. And while this had worked out very well for him back in his prior home, taking the company to all new heights in fact, it was not something the WCW audience were all too interested in. To be fair though, it certainly didn't help matters that by this point WWF audiences were pretty tired of the Hulkamania shtick too, as it had already gotten a little long in the tooth. Even if that was the case, however, the numbers were showing that overall, the Hogan experiment was working for World Championship Wrestling, as it was allowing them to turn a profit for the first time in their existence. So Eric Bischoff chose to double down on it, bringing in more WWF stars in order to further cement his company as the place where the big boys play. All this while Vince McMahon was struggling to discover what his company's new identity was going to be post-Golden Era. Yes, for the first time things were actually looking good for WCW from a business sense. And that was the point Ted Turner, feeling a change in the air, decided to present Bischoff with a question. What would it take for him to beat WWF entirely? Needless to say then, Eazy-E's answer here would have huge ramifications for the future, as he'd tell his boss he needed a TV show in a primetime spot on TNT on Monday nights, a spot which would put their show in direct competition to WWF's flagship, Monday Night Raw. How would Ted respond? He'd give Eric what he wanted. After all, he owned the network, and so it was that Monday Nitro was born. But this wouldn't just be the birth of Nitro. No, it would also be the birth of the Monday Night Wars. That's right, going forward, WWF and WCW were going to be engaged in a ratings war week in and week out. And in order to set the tone for the way he wanted to do battle as the weeks and months went on, Bischoff would start off the first episode of Nitro with a huge shocker of a moment. What was this shocker? Well, it would be Lex Luger randomly appearing to signify that he jumped to the competition. Obviously then, this was a huge event, as most people in WWF weren't even aware Lex's contract had expired by that point. Yes, the gloves were off here, and the must-see television effect Eazy-E had created with this one single move was only added to by the fact that unlike Raw, Nitro was going to be live every week, meaning anything truly could happen. Still though, for as much as this led to Nitro trading wins back and forth with Raw during the early months of the war, there was always a sense that WCW were the clear number 2, and that was not something Eric Bischoff was happy with. No, his goal was to destroy WWF completely, so he set about trying to make his show as different as possible from what Vince McMahon was doing back then, all in the hopes that this would draw more eyeballs toward his product. If WWF was in a particularly cartoonish stage of their history as the new generation waged on, then WCW was going to be all about more realistic portrayals of wrestlers and storylines instead. Of course, a big problem in this strategy, however, was Hulk Hogan. By then, he was still doing the old Hulkamania shtick, and in terms of buy rates and TV ratings, it wasn't really working anymore as 1995 came along. So it was then that after attending a New Japan Pro Wrestling show and seeing a storyline play out there where the Universal Wrestling Federation invaded the show, Eric Bischoff came up with a very risky idea which, if it worked, he believed would pay off big time. Not that it would include Hulk Hogan during the early weeks though. No, the first thing Eazy-E had to finalize was the signing of Diesel and Razor Ramon away from the WWF, two of that company's biggest stars of the time. You see, after growing increasingly frustrated with their payoffs during a particularly lean time in that company's history, those two performers had been enticed to jump ship to WCW themselves when Eric Bischoff offered them both huge money-guaranteed contracts. And when both eventually agreed to make that jump, it would set the wheel in motion for Eric's big plan, as it would be in May of 1996 that Scott Hall walked out of the crowd on an episode of Nitro to announce that he was here to take over. And he wasn't alone either. No, pretty soon after this, he'd be joined by his buddy Kevin Nash as the two began to present themselves on screen as invaders who'd come from WWF to destroy the competition. A couple of outsiders, if you will. Needless to say then, this got a lot of people more interested in what WCW was doing all of a sudden. But that wouldn't be the ace in the hole for Eric Bischoff here. No, his ace in the hole would be the tease of a third man who was working with the Outsiders, a third man who at Bash at the Beach 1996 would be revealed to be Hulk Hogan himself. Yes, in a true shocker of a moment, Hogan had turned heel and in the process formed a new stable with Hall and Nash, one known as the New World Order. And the New World Order's mission statement going forward was clear: they were going to take over WCW. As you would expect then, a character shift as monumental as this brought a lot of new eyeballs to the World Championship Wrestling product, as for the first time, WCW started to truly overtake WWF in terms of popularity. Of course, it wasn't just the Hogan heel turn that made all this work though. No, it was also the wild television the New World Order created overall, as with them acting like a pack of dogs invading the show each and every week, Nitro suddenly had an air of realism and danger to it which Raw simply couldn't compete with at the time. This marked the start of the 83-week run in which WCW would dominate WWF in the weekly TV ratings and would, at one point, damn near see them put Vince McMahon's company out of business. That's right, as the second half of 1996 bled into 1997, World Championship Wrestling truly was on fire, as despite being the heels, the NWO became the coolest thing in wrestling. So cool were they, in fact, they sparked the early stages of another boom period in the industry by making WCW the thing all school kids wanted to talk about on the playground. Seriously, back then, NWO shirts were everywhere, and Eric Bischoff was only too happy to bask in the glory of his success as he eventually became a member of the group himself. Really, if you wanted to call this one the greatest angle of all time, there would be a solid case to be made for it. Sure, it did need to end at some point, ideally with a babyface overthrowing the heel invaders, but all throughout 1997, WCW had this babyface quite literally waiting in the rafters in the form of Sting. You see, by that point, Sting was someone who had undergone a far darker, more gothic transformation as he became a living eulogy to World Championship Wrestling and everything it once represented. And this meant he became a symbol to fans, a symbol of their hopes that the heroes could eventually prevail. All of this then led to Starrcade 1997, the night where, after a year and a half of teasing, Sting and Hulk Hogan were finally going to meet in the ring for the ultimate battle over the WCW World Heavyweight title. Really, at the time, it felt like this might represent the end of the Monday Night Wars because with WWF never closer to going out of business, there was the sense that all Eric Bischoff had to do was stick the landing here and his competition would be killed off entirely. But that's not what happened because, in the end, the finish of Starrcade that year would be botched spectacularly when a mess of an ending saw the referee neglect to go with a planned fast count designed to screw Sting. A fast count which was supposed to then be immediately overturned as Steve Borden came out on top fairly. So because the count was normal, it made it look like Hogan had simply pinned the babyface clean in the middle of the ring, something which instantly sucked all the air out of the room and defanged the entire 18 months long angle in a heartbeat. Honestly, it was probably one of the biggest botches to ever happen, and while it's never been fully confirmed who was to blame here, many have levied the blame at Hulk Hogan and his creative control clause. You see, as part of the deal to get Hogan to sign with WCW back in 1996, Eric Bischoff had given Terry Bollea complete creative control over his character, meaning if he didn't like the way a finish or even an entire storyline made him look, he was able to veto it with a snap of his fingers. And that would cause huge problems as time went on because it became impossible to book the best show when performers on it who were more concerned with their own characters than with the overall quality had the power to overwrite anything they didn't like. But that was far from the only problem WCW was having as 1998 began. No, after the disaster which had been Starrcade 97 seriously hobbled their momentum, WWF chose that moment to catch fire once more with the rise of Stone Cold Steve Austin, meaning that come the early spring, they'd have ended the 83-week-long streak of ratings defeats to take the lead once more. So to combat this, Eric Bischoff doubled down on what had worked for him up until then, the NWO. The only problem was, by this point the NWO had grown stale and really should have started drawing to a close the winter prior. But now, rather than a new day of babyface victory being the thing for WCW, the heel group would only take over even more TV time as they engaged in an on-screen civil war by dividing into two separate factions, NWO Hollywood led by Hulk Hogan and the NWO Wolfpack led by Kevin Nash. And as if that weren't bad enough, fans would have even less to be excited about as hot-shotting big moments and celebrity involvement became an even bigger focus for Eric Bischoff, all as he desperately tried to catch up to WWF once again. And while this was happening, he was continuing to lose more and more control of his locker room as big egos and creative power made it increasingly difficult to put together a cohesive show each and every week. Then, of course, there was the addition of Thunder, a 2-hour-long secondary live show every week, which added even more strain to Eric Bischoff's already full schedule. Really, the only thing he had left going for him after a certain point was a young rookie by the name of Bill Goldberg. Yes, in the summer of 1998, there was still hope for WCW in the form of this Tulsa native, and that was evident in how over he'd been getting with his undefeated streak. So when the company finally decided to pull the trigger on him by having him beat Hulk Hogan for the WCW World Heavyweight title on the July 6th episode of Nitro that year, it was a huge win for Eazy-E. Sadly though, this would be his last big win, as even if Bill was now the new champion, the same problems of creative control would remain. So that would mean his run would be completely overshadowed by the continued adventures of Terry Bollea and the NWO's Civil War. All of this would come to a head on the January 4th, 1999 episode of Nitro, a night which many see in hindsight as the true jumping the shark moment for World Championship Wrestling. Why is that? Well, it was the night where not only did Tony Schiavone's Butts and Seats line famously backfire when it led to millions of people changing the channel to watch Mick Foley win the WWF title on Raw, but the infamous finger poke of doom also happened. Now, the full story of the finger poke of doom is too in-depth to get into here, but the long and short of it is that once it was over, not only were the NWO fully reformed as one big powerhouse heel stable yet again, but Hulk Hogan was once more the WCW World Heavyweight Champion, with all this setting us right back to square one, as it made the prior 2.5 years feel like they were all for nothing. Yes, by 1999, it was clear that WCW couldn't move on from the New World Order as they had no other big ideas in the chamber. And this was causing much frustration amongst the younger members of the locker room, as they routinely felt like they were being held down by the political power Hogan and company had. So it was then that as people like Chris Jericho were jumping ship to WWF, striking a critical blow to WCW's prized cruiserweight division in the process, Eric Bischoff was finally being relieved of power as a new head booker was eventually brought in to run the show. Unfortunately for WCW fans, however, this new booker would not be the savior he initially seemed to be. No, in Vince Russo, what you had was someone who had some great ideas, but without someone to rein these ideas in, things could very quickly get out of control. And that would lead to WCW 2000, the most infamous year of creativity any wrestling company has ever had. What were some of the lowlights on display here? How about David Arquette becoming WCW champion, or Goldberg infamously refusing to follow the script? And if not that, how about the debacle that was Bash at the Beach 2000, or the fact that by the time the year was over, the world title would have changed hands a staggering 26 times? Really, this one has to be seen to be believed, and we could never do it full justice here. What we will say though is that the proof was in the pudding in terms of fan interest, because by the time 2000 was over, WCW's TV ratings, attendances, and pay-per-view buy rates had all plummeted. And when it came to finances, well, in the space of just 12 months, they lost a total of $60 million. Still though, as long as Ted Turner was in power, the company was going to be secure, right? Well, yes, But the problem with that was Ted Turner wasn't going to be in power for much longer. No, it would be in early 2001 that in a huge corporate merger, Turner Broadcasting amalgamated with AOL, creating Time Warner. And in the process of this merger, the man who had been in control of the former company suddenly found himself no longer in charge anymore. So because of that, WCW's safety net was gone. And when new head of the TNT network, Jamie Kellner, was brought on board, he took one look at the amount of money the promotion was hemorrhaging and decided to pull the plug on the whole thing there and then. Yes, like that, WCW was without a home. And though Eric Bischoff would make an attempt to purchase the company himself, the fact Time Warner was not willing to give him the TV time as part of the deal made the whole thing worthless in his eyes. Really then, this marked the end of an era in wrestling because while the company would end up being bought by someone in March of 2001, that person would be none other than Vince McMahon. And we all know what happened next. A botched invasion angle which killed any lingering hopes which might have remained about WCW one day returning to its old glory. But to be honest, even if World Championship Wrestling had been a success under the WWF banner, it was never going to be the company of old, as by this point it was quite literally owned by the competition. No, as soon as the doors closed on the final episode of Nitro on March 26th of that year, the promotion many fans grew up loving was dead and gone. But none of that should take away from the importance the promotion has in wrestling's history. After all, while the fall was harsh, the rise was great to watch, and it forever changed the rules of North American wrestling. So in the end, while WCW's death was always going to be inevitable after a certain point, they'll always have an important place in the wrestling history for truly changing the game right when it needed to be changed the most.